Welcome to CENSIS Conversations. CENSIS is Scotland's innovation centre for sensing, imaging and Internet of Things technologies. CENSIS normally holds lots of events throughout the year, gathering people from across industries to network, debate and share ideas. However, of course, the challenges we've all faced around COVID-19 has meant we've had to hit pause on their regular event schedule and find new ways to engage with their communities. So while you may be unable to attend a CENSIS event right now, they have found a way to bring it to you in a new online discussion panel format. Our conversations will touch on engineering, technology and innovation from the viewpoint of technology developers, service providers and, of course, the end users. We're going to be looking at examples of what's happening in the sector right now, challenges businesses are facing, and how sensing, imaging and IoT is being used to help overcome technology barriers and, of course, transform organisations. So for this conversation, we're going to be talking about some of the cross-cutting challenges around transport and logistics, exploring how technology can be used to create smart, connected, integrated, and of course, sustainable transport networks that benefit both operators and service users. Hello everyone, welcome to CENSIS Conversations. My name is Gemma Milne. I'm a science and technology writer, and today we're going to be jumping into this brilliant topic, planes, trains and automobiles getting mileage from sensing, imaging and IoT to deliver a smart, sustainable Scottish transport system. And I'm really excited to be joined by four wonderful guests. Before we kind of get in deep to the topic, I wonder if each of you, we could go around and do really brief introductions. Cade, let's start with you.
Hi, my name's Cade. I'm one of the business development managers at CENSIS.
Thank you. Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve Cassidy. I am a director of Fuse Mobility and co-founder. It's a startup in technology.
Brilliant. And Tom?
Hi there, I'm Tom Rafferty. I'm Head of Innovation for Cofficient IoT, looking at innovation, digital transformation and leading edge IoT technologies.
Thank you, Tom. And finally, Amy.
Hiya, I'm Amye Ferguson. I'm a Senior Project Officer at Aberdeen City Council, working in the Smart Cities team, and I'm also the Project Manager for an EU-funded project, Civitas Portis.
Thank you. Thank you guys for all introducing yourselves. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about planes, trains and automobiles and talking about transport and logistics and specifically how we get mileage from sensing, imaging and IoT. So Cade, I'd love to start with you. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of a view from the bridge, give us a little bit of scene setting around this sensing, IoT and imaging space, specifically within transport and logistics.
CENSIS is the innovation centre for sensing, imaging and IoT based in Scotland. We help both private and public organisations overcome challenges using technology to help develop new products, services and processes. And often these processes are bringing about transformational changes within the organisations. We've delivered over 200 projects to date, and increasingly we are seeing interest in projects in the transport and logistics space.
Thank you for that, Cade. So let's kind of go around the room. Steve, I'd love to, around the virtual room, shall we say. Steve, I'd love to start with you. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what you guys are doing and how that feeds into this new thinking around how we do transport and logistics.
Sure, yeah. So we work in an area called mobility as a service, which is all very exciting. So most people have heard of software as a service. So mobility as a service is something that's sort of newish, I suppose, and that is the idea of moving away from owning something like a car, which sits on your driveway quite a lot, to being able to have a service subscription to all your mobility. And so we at Fuse, we basically within one app can allow you to plan, book and pay for all of your travel, multi-modal travel around the cities and different areas. And it is really getting away from that ownership, which is quite an archaic model, so why should you always have a certain type of car on your driveway which you never use, whereas you can get a whole blend of things that really work for you and your family and this real complexity of people's lives. It's really about making people's life simple with technology, and transport's very messy and dirty.
Amazing. It also sounds like personalization comes into that too, about being able to kind of utilize the resources in the world for each individual's specific circumstances as much as possible.
Exactly. Let's get something that works for you and your family in that moment, And so you can travel easier, better, because really using a blend of modes. The car is very easy. You've got your car keys. It's not easy for everybody, but it's generally an easy mode. But if you're going to try and do multimodal travel, it takes a lot of cognitive awareness. It takes awareness. You've got to know what's out there. If you haven't used a bus for years, how do you actually know what's running, how it runs, how it works, what the etiquette is, what the tickets are? There are in Scotland, I think there are 300. I did look it up. I look at my piece of paper. 393 bus companies in Scotland.
Wow.
55 million different types of tickets on UK rail. It takes a lot of cognitive, physical, economic acuity, I think, to be able to use it. It's just to make it simple, make people aware of what options work for them. Exactly right. Personalisation, 100%.
Amazing. Lots in there about information handling as well, which I'd love to dive into in this conversation. But for now, let's move over to Tom. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you guys are focusing on and how you kind of think about this new world that we're in right now when it comes to transport and logistics?
Because in terms of some of the IoT technologies that we're working with just now, and again integrating that with telematics. So an area that we're focusing on just now, particularly with a couple of companies in Scotland in waste management and with a lot of fleet management companies. So through transportation and logistics, we're covering things like fleet and vehicle tracking up to the second GPS tracking on on HGV vehicles, from driver safety, compliance, including things like predictive maintenance, operational efficiency, and even through to things like route optimization. So this is a system where we're integrating back-end into ERP solution for all the job management and the financial side of it. But we also have live telematics, including things like geofencing, where we can calculate very accurately things like time on site for a particular vehicle. The vehicle draws up to a particular location on site. He's on there for a duration of period. And the minute or the second that he leaves that geofence, there's an automated bill that's sent back to the client. Now that's in terms of building in the efficiencies into the process. Now the other things in there is looking at some of the job management, where we can feed a range of, say for instance, 200 jobs per day, and the route optimization software will then coordinate that to in-cab. It will triangulate to the particular driver. He will get his plan on a mobile device in-cab, and it will give him proper route optimization, and obviously looking at the directional details, to the end customer. So it's a whole integrated solution, including the things like telematics, route optimization, and back-end ERP solution. So that's where we're looking at, building these three platforms, together to have one. It's like almost one application where we have one sign-on, and the fleet managers have everything at their fingertips. Because the key thing, we're working with some of the main dealers, say like Volvo, for example, on things like diagnostics. So we've got over-there diagnostic information that's going real time to particular, the maintenance teams, so we can categorize the type of defects that potentially are coming up. And this is where we look at AI and machine learning for predictive maintenance for vehicles. And that has a big impact on, looking at making sure that the fleets are in best health possible. So there's a whole range of things, and we're moving into areas like adopting IoT sensors within the vehicles themselves, so that we know the capacity real time of particular tankers, so that we can route them, accordingly. So there's a lot of technologies that we're, putting into one system that gives the entire, gamut of, fleet telematics, as it were, for any transport and logistic business.
Yeah, there are definitely lots of themes around there. Again, around information management, putting data to use, but also about optimization. So we'll definitely come into some of those themes. Amye, I want to come to you for our final sort of deep dive into what you're doing and what the kind of current state of things looks like for what's happening in Aberdeen transport and logistics.
Yeah, sure. So in the introduction, I mentioned our project Civitas Portis, which is a EU-funded project which looks at sustainable mobility solutions operations in port cities in Aberdeen, of course, having a harbour situated to the heart of our city centre. As part of that, there are several measures that we're doing, which involves like technology and data and the use of that. But one of the main measures that we're looking at, which is really exciting for the city, I believe, is the development of a smart journey planning app. It's not quite a mobility as a service solution quite as yet, but it definitely is a longer term ambition to become that. But in the first kind of early development of that, what we're looking at is the integration of data from various different sources and how we can use that to potentially be behavioural nudges to encourage individuals out of the private vehicle and onto more multimodal journeys. But as part of that, you've got to have a whole range of active travel infrastructure improvements at the same time as that. Just when I'm hearing the conversation, I just want to touch on another bit of really innovative work that we're doing as part of the city, not as part of Portis, but as part of ERDF, the Smart Cities, Scotland's 8 city work. Aberdeen City Council really looked at intelligent street lighting. So, and as part of our procurement, we had to focus more on the communications network. So we deployed LoRaWAN gateways, and through those gateways, we can actually control nodes on each of the street lighting columns. So it is an intelligent street lighting project, but actually it's a much wider project than that because we've got sensors. So from the smart belly bins that we have, we've got waste as well, air quality and flooding are all connected onto that central management system. So that's another really exciting project and just goes to show the innovation happening in the city right now.
Amye, I'm going to stick with you actually for the next question, and we'll get back to get the views from the others as well. But I think something that's been mentioned in all of these kind of intros and views from the bridge is this idea of trying to integrate many different physical systems, informational systems, different kinds of people and different kinds of jobs. And with your role, obviously working, representing a city and representing the people of that city as well, what do you sort of see as the difference between the opportunity that all these different technologies are bringing versus the reality of perhaps the challenges of starting to implement? What are you kind of up against right now that you see as something to still have to work on?
Yeah, so what's been challenging is smart technology has been quite new to me, and the development of a smart journey app, like having developers behind us who are giving that support, has been really helpful. But what I find challenging as an officer is getting around the privacy notices, the governance around it, the data, the GDPR, and for me that's been quite challenging. You want to supply a product that's going to be helpful for your citizens, but you've got maybe some institutional organization barriers that you've got to come across first, especially for something as new to it as for me. So that's been quite an interesting one to come across. And I hope going forward, especially when we come to AI, that transparency, that ethics in the data is going to be if we've got a checklist or toolbox, for example, we were some of the first officers maybe in the council to be developing this sort of thing. So having our best practice now that we can now share with colleagues or other cities and organisations is really helpful.
I want to come to both Steve and Tom for this one because if there's a lot of discussion about, with new exciting technologies, innovation and whatnot, we often look to startups or to agile companies that are able to dive into these new technologies or create these new technologies and then sell them onto the market. And of course, with some kinds of technologies, you don't necessarily have to integrate with these huge sort of social systems. Again, both physical and informational. So I wonder if you could both talk a little bit, maybe Steve, we'll start with you because I know you've already worked with Amye up in Aberdeen, about what it's like from a company perspective, how to innovate quickly, do all the sort of fail fast and all these ideas that we have around innovation, but at the same time, actually implement at scale somewhere like an entire country like Scotland.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that innovation and that agility is, we came out of Fuse Mobility came out of being the R&D division of a larger organisation, a transport services company, and it's been great. We're a little bit like Pitpon is released at being able to, really look at really try and discover where that user value is and being able to understand what problems and everyday life problems we can solve. And going back to Aberdeen's a great example. So the contract there is very much built around user engagement and design sprints and co-creation. And okay, we've got a platform and we've invested a lot in the platform, and that brings together all this messy data that we're talking about. And we can, through a front end, can make it all very legible. But the great transport system of the future isn't going to be designed by a load of transport people sitting in a transport room talking about transport. It's about talking to people about their real lives. So we've gone, through working with Amye, we've gone through 2 or 3 or 4, really. It depends how you define it, different co-design sprints, talking to people from a range of backgrounds and talking to them about the travel, and then trying to say, well, what are the real features that will make a difference to your lives? So that's been good. And then the scaling bit, so that's the agility bit, getting close to users. That's been really exciting. The other thing about the scaling question is a good one. So we ourselves have a platform which can bring in data. That data, as I say, if there's data available, and it goes back to the early questions about from everything from remote sensing to urban traffic control data, which is something that we're getting from Aberdeen. If we can get that data into the platform, we can then, in other cities that have similar approaches, or there is open data that's available, which we can maybe talk about later. The Transport Bill in Scotland is making that more available. We can then implement in other places, and we've learned from one place to another. And so there's lots of things, for example, that we're doing with National Rail, which will apply to whichever city or region we work in the UK. There's other things that are a little bit more localized. And I think the last thing on that, I would say, is it's always about one thing that we found very early in Aberdeen was that we can be better than Google Maps if we are personalized and if we are localized. And yes, you can get the economies of scale with a big platform, but you've got to make it relevant to people and their city and their region and their lives. And so it's that simultaneous level, I think, in terms of upscaling that you need.
Yeah, it's interesting that kind of having to think about scale when you're talking about an entire city, entire country, but at the same time about that localized knowledge. I guess it's trying to get the balance between the two. Tom, I'd love to come to you to kind of talk a little bit about that from a logistics perspective, because, for the sort of everyday people that are going about thinking about traveling around a city or commuting or whatever it is, sort of supply chains and getting things from A to B is not always necessarily what first comes to mind, but it's obviously a deeply, a huge system, complex system with lots going on. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit again about this idea of the sort of opportunity versus the implementation, and what have been some of the challenges up against you guys.
Sure thing, Gemma. Yeah, because I think one of the kind of key things, we always kind of use the kind of mantra of, think big, start small and scale fast. One of the key things that we're always looking at is to get quick wins very early in terms of the project. So that gives us the confidence, in terms of the teams that we're working with. So say, for instance, when we're looking at, if we're looking at transport and logistics, when we're looking at, HGV drivers, for example, how do we onboard them in terms of the technologies that are available now? They're going from pen and paper to, even going into mobility, use mobile devices as part of their everyday kind of day-to-day workings. So one of the things where we try to make sure that they're on board and they understand everything that we're doing, in terms of the technology. We bring them in and we start, as we said, we start at small. We give them confidence that we can, we're listening to, what their issues are and how we address those. So the key thing that we found as part of the drivers, and this is one of the areas that we touched on, is in terms of driver safety and compliance and a whole range of, some of the new, shall we say, some of the new reports that's coming in, that's available from real-time telematics and all the different systems, is to bring them, through a driver training program. We call this ADAS, which is an assisted driver, training program. And what that's got is we have things like in-cab video technology that's monitoring the performance of the driver. And one of the things, they've got a lot of fears about, spy in the cab and all this kind of, some of these, with these new technologies. But the first thing we found is that, first issue, I think there was an accident, happened in one of the vehicles, but the driver was immediately exonerated because there was a real-time video that was sent to the insurance company to say that driver was not at fault. So the driver was then saying, wow, I've just had so much paperwork to fill in, in the past. It would have been, the blame was normally given to the, HGV driver. But in this case, it was very clearly that the driver was not at fault. So that was an early stage, example we had with putting cameras, and these cameras have got 120 point facial recognition, built in so that we can tell where the driver is, whether he's not attentive. So all these technologies are supporting the onboarding with some of the implementation programs that we're looking at and, adopting the, telematics technologies in place.
I suppose then it's, oh, sorry, on you go.
No, the only thing I was going to touch on was the next stage of that was looking at driver gamification. You know, where we have driver scores on their performance, like harsh braking, harsh events, even down to like speeding and fuel efficiencies, and even things down to like crashes. So there was like a driver scoreboard, and this is all available in the driver app. So one of the things that we found over the course of the last 3 months is, the performance in driving has got a lot better, shall we say. There's been fewer incidents, fewer accidents. And again, the insurance premiums have got a knock-on effect as well. So that way they're saving up to 10 to 15% on insurance, because of the systems that's in place, because that's an operational efficiency and it's cost saving for the business.
Amazing. I think there you're touching on some really interesting points around. We touched already on privacy and on information and kind of what we're all happy to allow into our system. So I want to touch on that a little bit next. But before we do that, Cade, I want to come to you because obviously your role is in some sense a bit of a connector role and an enabler role, connecting together the government, the local governments, the companies, the innovators, the universities. And again, when it comes to this, coming up with new ideas around technology, we can talk about the opportunities tons and say, look, we could put this sensor in here, we could do this, da 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 da. And of course, that is part of this kicking off. We have to ideate. But when it comes again to implementation, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about perhaps one or two of the projects that you've worked on, and again, what this looks like in terms of marrying these innovations with realistic kind of problem solving in the real world in cities.
Certainly. So part of the challenge for organizations who are looking to develop new products and services to address challenges is actually that link to end users. So in part of what we do at CENSIS, we bring together collaborations between technology solution providers as well as end users. But we also work directly with the technology developer to develop these solutions. So two examples of project that we've worked on are around the optimization for fleet management and logistics hubs. We worked with one company called FuelLink, who were looking at optimizing the refueling of vehicles, whether that be vans, buses, lorries, or indeed cars. And they worked with us to develop a solution, which they brought to market called Vinny. And this solution enables a vehicle to approach a petrol pump, for the petrol pump to recognize that vehicle, to recognize the driver. It downloads information from the onboard computer within the vehicle about how many miles the vehicle has done, the level of fuel within the fuel tank, and dispense the right fuel, the right quantity of fuel to that vehicle. Now, where that is an advantage is it's automated. So there isn't the manual input, there isn't the requirement for filling in paperwork and that human interaction. But I suppose the other really useful benefit is that you are understanding how your vehicle's using that fuel. So it might indicate there's a problem with the vehicle that might need some maintenance, or whether maybe fuel's been siphoned when it's on the road. So there are these other benefits, as well as actually speeding up the process of fueling the vehicle. And the other area which we've looked at recently is around 24/7 logistics hubs, where there's this real interest of getting lorries into a bay filled with pallets, with products on, and then out again as effectively and as safely as possible. And this is where we were aware of solutions which would be used for smart parking solutions within cities. And we were aware of a supplier of this technology. We worked with a supplier and an end user, a logistics company within Scotland, to trial these smart parking sensors within parking bays. They were designed predominantly for sensing cars. So the first question was, can you detect a 22-ton lorry within the bay? And did it have the right resolution? So you could actually measure the amount of time it spent within the bay, and how could you relay that to the driver as well as the fleet management organization to improve the operation, to get that smoother interaction from when the vehicle entered the depot to when it left. So that's just two examples. But where I think it's very exciting for CENSIS is where we bring in other partners, other organizations, where we have both public sector, commercial, and also academic partners coming together to solve challenges. And this is where CENSIS is looking at some of the more fundamental challenges we have in being able to effectively identify people, the type of vehicle in changing conditions within urban and rural spaces. And we've funded projects within this space, but also in areas where we're trying to understand that flow of people through such a diverse built environment that we have within Scotland. And this is understanding how somebody gets from A to B effectively, how you can understand the journey that they're going through, but without infringing on the privacy of that individual. And this is where cybersecurity and cyber resilience and the trust and privacy aspects that Amye touched upon come into play.
Yeah, so let's talk about data, because I think there's quite a lot to talk about data. Specifically, I guess it's at the root of everything we're talking about. It's the fuel at the center of all this. So I think on one hand, you've kind of got the questions around privacy and having to balance making things useful and being able to kind of supercharge and optimize and all these sorts of things with possibly infringing on particular kind of rights or people not necessarily knowing what they're giving access to. But also on the other side, we have a huge sort of technical challenge around making sure we've got good data, clean data, data that's actually relevant and who owns it and all this sort of thing. So Amye, let's start with you, because I can imagine in your role, you must have to think about so many different elements of this, shall we say, data lifecycle. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how you've been working with it.
So what we do at the council is that if any time we were thinking about collecting data, we have to have a use case. So we've got to have a clear purpose as to why we're collecting data and how it's going to be used, and the data ownership, like you say. We probably also do some sort of paperwork, a governance around that as well. So like a data privacy impact assessment. So that kind of goes to our data protection officer for approval, and we go back and advise it as and when we need to do that. But like you say, there's a lot of data that goes around. We've got an open data platform that we developed as a council as part of the ERDF Smart Cities programme as well. So that's to encourage innovation out in the public and what, there's other organisations out there. So as part of the City Region Deal work, we've got a digital working group, and some of those partners, or they do engagement sessions with the public, they can use that sorts of data sources to bring about those innovation and new products and services in the city.
Steve, I want to come to you, because you obviously started off by talking about all these, however many it was, 300,000. I don't even remember, you were throwing numbers at me and it seems like a lot. And I think that's kind of, part of it when we come to talking about a lot of these future technologies. It is wrestling with data from all different sources, trying to somehow match it up, data from one company with another council and so on and so forth. So I wonder where are we in Scotland when it comes to our kind of cleanness of data or usableness of data, as it were?
I think there's the new transport bill that was passed last year in October will improve things in terms of data provision from bus companies. The bus companies figure, which I mentioned, 393 bus companies. So there'll be new requirements on all the bus companies to provide different levels of data. So that's good. I mean, Scotland isn't too bad. We can get data which exists, and we integrate information from Google, from Travelline, and we just make it more usable. But then there's other information sources. So the Aberdeen example is a good one in that their urban traffic control data, we can bring that. So real-time parking data, for example, or events on the network, we can bring that into the app. So somebody has something that they have trust and confidence in the information and the app, and that is providing that's a good service. I think that's the key. I mean, they're the words that we always come back to in most of our discussions, is trust and confidence with the input information, trust and confidence with the output information and the overall service. And, if that doesn't exist, we haven't got anything. We implemented a service for young people a couple of years ago, something called Navigogo, which we co-designed with young people from Young Scot, a national charity in Scotland. And it was really to help people when they got to a certain age, not necessarily own a car, so that they could maybe get a driving license and use car clubs, but basically not necessarily own a car. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time with young Scott was their 5 rights about data for young people to know what information to give out and what they should expect, and making things very, very simple, because we spend a lot of time on terms and conditions and privacy policies, but we've got to make it really accessible to people. And that was a very good example of improving trust and confidence in the service. And the other one was actually in Aberdeen. We were talking to the youth committee for Aberdeen City Council. And one of the things that came out very strongly was for that personalised information. If people can, within the apps that we develop and with our platform, we have personalisation modules where you can enter a little bit of information about yourself, and then you can get the very personalised price. So if you've got a national rail card, or if you've got a concessionary pass, or if you're of a certain age, we can tell you what peak and off-peak means to you, how much it will cost you for that trip. And some people, the young people in the youth committee said, people can use it without registering all that data. But if they register that data, they can get something fantastic back. And they said, please make sure that people understand the value of registering. Please get them to know that, because it would be so valuable to us, particularly as everything's changed post-COVID and there's a lot of uncertainty on the network. So again, it's trust and confidence to put your data in, and trust and confidence in getting that data out, and how you do it, from privacy policies to making those things easy, and also how you encourage people to actually use these services with confidence, really.
So I was about to say we've gone almost, about half an hour without mentioning COVID, but you just did, Steve. So that means we're going to have to talk about COVID as the next part of our discussion. And Tom, I'm going to start with you, but I want to hear from all of you guys. Obviously, working in the logistics space, we all know is like supply chain has kind of had its moment in the news. I think at the moment, obviously, people really realizing how interconnected our systems are and how dependent they are on, or interdependent they are rather. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about possibly some of the impacts of COVID on the sort of area that you work in, but also how you've been able to utilize technology to kind of keep going during the pandemic, but B, start to build new systems.
Yeah, sure. Because I think initially was bringing drivers back to work, in a safe environment, because that was one of the key issues. How do we onboard drivers back in to be safe when they're actually on site as well, and to give that confidence back to the end customer that they're basically been tested. So one of the first things that we'd implemented as part of the onboarding process was temperature scanning. And one of the things it tied in with, it's all about integration. So what we had was a temperature-based scanning camera that was linked to, it was almost like a kind of clock-in system, but not so much as, monitoring for that purpose, but it was more so, and it was through retina scan where we're doing temperature monitoring. So they can even use their masks, for example, but still have temperature testing. That was all time-stamped, and it was all available on the driver app. So the driver can then, when he comes on site, he then has got a sign notification to say that this driver is safe. He has been tested. So that was the first kind of part of the process that, we'd implemented. The next part was through the mobile app technology, where we brought in sanitization checks as part of vehicle inspections. So through this thing called DVIR process, where we had built a mobile app for the drivers to do his daily checks. But one of the key things was about the sanitization of the vehicles to ensure compliance on that, so that the fleet manager has awareness that every vehicle in his fleet has been going through the proper checks and regulation agreements to get people back into a safe environment. Because one of the things is you would have vehicles where they may have a change of driver, and we want to make sure that we're compliant in terms of those changeover processes. So it was putting an integrated temperature scanning process, and also looking at how do we adopt the mobile technology to compensate for COVID. And again, we put in some cleaning processes through some of the new technologies for that as well, in-cab sanitization, as well as, monitoring. And again, it was all back to data. So we had actionable insights as part of, the reporting applications and dashboards, within the platform. So that came back, and the fleet managers can check one of the drivers missed an inspection this morning. He would actually not allow that vehicle out of the yard. And again, we can all do that through geofencing. So through the technology, if a vehicle had not had its sanitization checks and left the yard, there would be an alert, an SMS message that would be sent directly to the fleet manager. And one of the technologies that we've got in the cabs is live text to speech within the vehicle. So the camera has a speech module so that we can communicate directly with the drivers. And that was one of the key successes because, in fact, the company we were working with in terms of wastewater were one of the first companies to get back, to become profitable again, to actually get his full fleet up and running within a week. And he was back into profitability.
I think one of the big things you're talking here about is, reacting to what's happened and making sure that people can get back, that companies can survive. But I also want to talk about, obviously putting aside a lot of the horrendous stuff that is happening as a result of the pandemic, but thinking about, particularly with public transport, the opportunity perhaps that this pause of sorts is giving us to maybe rethink how we design, how we do things. Amye, I want to come to you to hear your views, obviously from that city perspective.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to kind of touch on quickly is that in Aberdeen, we have the Spaces for People project. Like many other Scottish cities, we've got funding from SUSTRANS to implement various different measures to help the social distancing. So as part of the Smart Journey Planning tool, we're looking at a how-to etiquette. So we already had one to make people feel a bit more comfortable about, confident about taking public transport. But now in light of COVID-19, it's more about the etiquette. So wearing your face mask, like reduce maybe timetables, if the capacity on buses as well. So like you're saying about the public transport. So we're doing that, incorporating that hopefully into the Smart Journey Planning app, and we're hoping to launch it soon as well. It's not fully undergone all the testing that we maybe wanted to because of COVID, but we've been thankfully doing a lot virtually for the co-design sessions to make sure there's progress in it. But because of the tie-in, because it could be a really useful tool for individuals in light of COVID, we're hopefully bringing that forward. And we've also maybe got some advertising space within the app as well. So what we're investigating at the moment is the potential to offer advertising space for businesses. So not only is it a journey tool, but it could lend itself to help support maybe the business recovery side as well and local economy. And culture team at the council has been in touch with us as well, if we can maybe potentially offer virtual walking tours. So again, trying to attract people back into the city. But going back to your question, how this can maybe the way I see it is maybe more demand responsive and going back to that whole connected vehicle side of things. And as a city as well, we're laying the digital foundations. There's a lot of connectivity. We're investing a lot from the city region deal into that. So it all brings together maybe that connected side, and people could maybe have a bit more of a demand response if they needed a public service, but it needs to be probably more of a bus occupancy. And again, that's a call we've had with Transport Scotland. We understand what they're doing, and we're following that with Aberdeenshire Council, who actually hold that bus data. But it's looking at the data format that they hold that and how that can be integrated into the journey planning app, because that's something we potentially want to do in the longer term as well. So there's quite a lot of things in there to think of. And we have a North East Bus Alliance partnership as well. So that keeps dialogue going between the local authorities with the bus operators and our regional transport partner too. So there's a lot of exciting things that could happen. But as an individual myself, probably what I don't want to do is be touching machines. So contactless payment, we've already got that in Aberdeen, but again, it comes back to that mass solution, reduction of touching machines and so on, that sanitisation, that hygiene, well, more hygienic. So I think it's going to be a changed world going forward.
I think you're spot on as bringing in mass as possibly being, and connectivity, as you say, and managing demand as being something that I think at the moment we're more doing out of need, and we just have to use these technologies in order to get back going. But actually it might possibly, I hope, accelerate some of the interesting innovations and opportunities that we've been talking about. Steve, is this what you're seeing on the ground, obviously working with mass every day?
Amy's spot on with her comments and what we've been finding. I do think that there's now an increased focus on I've spent most of my life trying to get people to use buses, and suddenly people were told not to use buses. I just started a journey planning company, which wasn't probably the best time to start a journey planning company. So I was a little bit nervous about a few things. But one thing that has come back very strongly is that in these times, we just have to encourage people to think and to plan, and again, to give trust and confidence. And so if the services like in Aberdeen and some of the other services that we're putting out, if people can use those services to think about what options are available and to know where there may be problems, and the etiquette is spot on, as Amye said. I think that's just a basic fundamental need. We're doing 3 services on our platform there. One is for the NHS, and obviously that's important, about making sure that people understand what services and what etiquette exists and how to get to hospital. The other one is for Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park, and some of the issues that we're looking at there is in terms of car parking. Particularly, we'd be interested in real-time car parking and understanding where the hotspots are, because obviously we've all read about various problems that we've had in open spaces. And then the other one is at a college, at Dundee and Angus College, and that is to help people to get to college better and easier, particularly if they don't have a car. And with that, there's obviously a lot of change in terms of going online, in terms of whether or not you need to come into the college when term starts, and people will be travelling much more flexibly. So stop, think, plan, understand, particularly if you're going to some of these big site attracts, and then think about how you're going to pay. I think the overall transactions now on transit, well, in the UK, 10%. There's only 10% of transactions in the UK that are actually using money. There's a push in generally in smart ticketing now to go to. Usually you have a monthly pass or a weekly pass. It's going to be much more pay as you go. There'll be a push for that, and using contactless payments. And so that is something that is important in terms of the offer from the public transport company, and indeed the mass services as well. So changing ticketing, changing how people are living their lives, but fundamentally it's the same thing. Stop, think, and have the right kind of service, and be prepared for what's out there with trust and confidence.
Awesome. Cade, is there anything you want to add on this COVID point that we're discussing?
I think for me personally, and if I look to my family, it's about thinking about journeys differently now, thinking about a wider range of options that we feel the most comfortable with. I have a personal preference not to use the car, to use public transport, but now it's also looking at actually cycling, for example, and bringing that into my family's life more on a day-to-day basis of getting around rather than just purely for enjoyment. And I think that's a very positive change.
It'd be interesting to see how culturally this changes our approach to how we think about transport. So Cade, I want to stick with you because you mentioned it in your introduction. How can we think about sensing, IoT, imaging, the impact it has on transport logistics through a sort of environmental green lens?
Wow, that's a great question, and quite a lengthy one, I think, to answer. But let's try. So I think in terms of IoT, one of the largest areas and one of the early adopters of the kind of principles of IoT have been around environmental sensing. So, for example, looking at the quality of the air that we breathe in our urban and rural spaces. And I think now it's a great opportunity to actually look at the technologies that are actually out there that can actually help to enhance the journeys that we do make. And just to think of an example, you could use things like air quality sensing to understand hotspots within maybe an urban area where there's a high density of traffic, a high density of pollution, and maybe you're looking to reduce that level of pollution. And you may redirect bus services, and you might do that in real time, for example, or you might redirect cars, but also you may provide feedback to people who are walking, for example, through that area that they might not want to walk through that particular area at that particular time. So there's that real opportunity to actually feedback benefits, not just to people who may be using vehicles and other forms of transport, but actually just people who are walking and actually occupying spaces. So that's, I think, a good example. That's something that I know that many cities and towns have looked at, adopting technologies. But, it could be taken, far more. And again, I think for me, it comes back to the integration with the other systems that already exist. A lot of the technologies we can use to improve services around transport within our towns, cities, and our villages actually already exist. It's about bringing these technologies together, ensuring that the data can flow from one place to another, that this data can be fused together to draw out new insights about the environment and transport and how the two interact. And that's where I think very much we see a very positive action in Scotland around open data, for example, and the initiative now of sharing this data, making this available, because it's engaging the public in this discussion, but also enabling people to experiment, to come up with new ways to understand the environment and bring about new services that can have a positive benefit, both environmentally and also from a transport standpoint.
I think Kade's absolutely on the market. It's so much more important, and in any project that we're planning now, it's really around maybe a power in Aberdeen, which is our sustainable energy action plan, as well as our local community plan and what we call a local outcome improvement plan. So environment's really top of the agenda, and at full council a few weeks ago, the energy transition was recognised as part of that and as part of the diversification of Aberdeen as well, away from traditionally the oil and gas, but to the low carbon kind of capital. So the council has been investing quite a lot into environmental projects. Like I say, we've got the Power in Aberdeen, which looks at our carbon management basically. And a lot of the Portis has looked at the emissions of that. So a big part of that has been looking at the traffic management. So we did an upgrade, or what I could be called as an upgrade of our CCTV to maximise or the efficiencies from the transport network, and is looking at that transport signalling. Maybe if things need to be rerouted around the city centre, like Cade was kind of mentioning, that stuff that we're looking at and doing at the moment. Car parking, dynamic car parking is something else that we're really interested in. In Aberdeen, there seems to be, people like to go to a certain car park. They don't mind if they have to wait in a queue, but trying to get that dynamically. So if we know that one particular area is really congested, can we move that to another area? But again, if we implement other solutions like the Act to Travel Hard kind of infrastructure, we're looking at procuring a bike hire supplier as well. So there's a range of stuff that we're doing at the moment, and including a low emission zone. We're looking into that and how we can use automatic number plate recognition to kind of enforce that as well. But a big part of what we're doing in Aberdeen too, as part of the whole diversification, is hydrogen. And I think Aberdeen's quite well recognised for the advancements that we have in hydrogen technology. And as part of Portis, we worked with private sector partners to get that kind of last mile delivery. So we initially had the idea for a consolidation centre in the south of the city centre. Unfortunately, there wasn't much appetite to do that, but we could still take forward that last mile initiative. So we've got some private sectors on board. I can't name them yet, but it's really exciting to get them on board. And for their respective fleets, it's the first hydrogen diesel van that they'll have. So it's a real positive for the city. And hopefully with time and more funding, because we've de-risked the technology as a council, we can get more private sectors on board with us. And we've got 2 hydrogen refueling stations as well. So we're laying the foundation, and we've got the EV charge points as well, because we see it as a real mixture of technologies to get that kind of environmental benefits that we're really looking for, as well as the economic side and sustainability.
Yeah, and it's so important that local councils, do invest. I want to go to you, Tom, because I think one of the interesting sort of shifts in conversation around environment, or at least from my perspective, when we're talking about businesses in particular, is environmental concerns not feeling like this, it's just something we do because we're a nice company, but actually because it's going to save us money. It's not just about sustainability of the environment, it's sustainability of business. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, when you're working with your various different partners and implementing these new technologies, how conversations around environment and whether or not the technologies really can provide business savings as well as a planet savings.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's one of the, in terms of the adoption of the technologies, is looking at what the return on investment is. You've got an initial outlay for the installation of the telematics, systems and software integration. So there's an initial outlay there, but what we're looking at, and this is one of the things where we're working at cost calculators to give you an indication of, say, over a 6-month period, you can get full return on investment back, for the technology you put in place. And that return is all about things like, fuel efficiency, because that's a key component of, looking at the telematics system. And this is where we've built things like fuel and energy efficiency reporting within the dashboard. We're looking at, things like the distance travelled, and analyse the fuel efficiency against that, looking at the fuel used, in a specific time frame, and obviously looking at those estimated costs, because the system can determine the cost of, the transportation, because this is where it ties in nicely with route optimization, because I know that particularly from an HGV standpoint, you've got restricted routes and low bridges and all this area. So HGVs predominantly would take they would be consuming more fuel because of the distances travelled. But one of the things I'd like to kind of touch on is, and Cade mentioned this, in terms of looking at the environmental conditions, where we can do proper route optimization and route the vehicles away from, heavy polluted areas. And that's a key component, working with some partners that we have, that if we've got access to that open data, then we could feed that into the system to then become, a cleaner environment. But back on to some of the other cost savings. One of the areas that we've just installed recently is, for example, idle time. And this is a key component of the driver, efficiency and the gamification thing that I spoke about earlier. Now, what this, in terms of true idling, gives us an indication is things called PTO, power takeoff. So one of the things is in terms of the wastewater industry, where there is, they're using pumps and motors, and the vehicle is idling all that time to supply power. Now, one of the things is we need to understand is when those motors and pumps are in operation, and we can connect directly to those to see whether, the vehicle is idling and the pump is on, or is the driver just, idling for idling's sake? And that's been a key component in terms of how do we reduce, carbon emissions, and obviously overall looking at, costs within the business. So they're the key components of some of the new reports, that are now available. We've now got them within the platform, and they're now been actively using in terms of getting back to that return on investment and cost saving from the initial outlay.
And Steve, I want to come to you finally to kind of give us your thoughts on the environment question too, and particularly, you've mentioned quite a few times in the discussion about the importance of users, and I wondered if the sort of role of being personally more responsible when it comes to the environment and your choices around transport has kind of come into play when you've been doing these user groups and the sort of building this business that you have.
I think that people want to do the right thing. I don't ever doubt that, ever. But people need to know the options and need to know what the difference will be that they will make by doing the right thing. And fundamentally, in terms of transport, they have to be able to get to hospital or get to college, or you have to be able to live their lives. So if we can enable both, so allow people to make a better choice, that's the way forward. I think in terms of the environment, one of the things that we have found is, it goes back to Cade and his family and cycling, and there's some real opportunities now, I think. I know from some of the work that we did in Aberdeen, actually, it's interesting how there was a high demand for understanding where good air quality was, so that you could walk or cycle through that area, and that that's feasible. There's a whole range of different people who cycle, and we talk to a lot of mammals, the middle-aged men in lycra, and we talk to a lot of people who are completely new to cycling, not confident, and there'll be a lot of people like that at the moment. Generally, when we've been talking to people, it was the non-confident people who wanted, I want somewhere where it's safe and quiet and I can take my time. Whereas the mammals were saying, well, actually, I get to work in 35 minutes, but sometimes I do it in 34. And so it was a different kind of offer. So I think presenting the information in the right form to different people in different ways to allow them to do the right thing, and recognizing that everybody's different. And I think it comes back to where we were in terms of personalization. If I could set my confidence level as a cyclist and be presented with a route to go for my confidence level, that would be absolutely spot on.
I think, this whole conversation comes back to, sensors, imaging, IoT. It gives us lots and lots and lots of information. That's the crux of these technologies, right? And if we can find ways of connecting up that data, presenting it in a way that's useful, utilizing it in a way that's both optimizing as well as good for the environment and whatnot, it's empowering everyone, whether it's businesses or councils or individual people. And with that, I want to ask one last question, which is kind of looking forward to the future a little bit. When you think about the future of transport and logistics, looking into your crystal ball, I would love to see what each of you see. So I'm going to start with Amye.
I think there's going to be a massive change, especially after COVID, towards the cycling and the walking and the real focus kind of on that. And I think it's going to, this is a total change of pace maybe of life as we start working from home a lot more. I think this whole COVID situation has just accelerated us possibly like 10 years or something like that. You know, and in a personal life, I always thought I was going to live city centre, but I just bought a house in the country, you know, because I knew I'm going to be working from home. And it was a lifestyle change. And I think that's going to be part of it because of cycling, more introduction of more cycle lanes. And I think at the same time, mobile is going to be king. I think it's important to remember to be inclusive. And that's something that I've really learned from the development of the Smart Journey Planning app, that's still really important. But for future generations, it's the mobile, it's been connected to their mobile and been able to do things on the move. So that whole mobility as a service, I think, is really exciting. And I'm really hopeful for the Smart Journey Planning tool. I think it's got a lot of potential for Aberdeen and the way it can go. So for me, that's the future, and I'm really excited to have played a part in it. And I think it's really exciting and positive for Aberdeen going forward.
Amazing, Amye. Tom, what are you seeing in your crystal ball?
In terms of technologies, is the adoption, obviously, of IoT within to drive efficiencies and cost saving. I think cost saving in terms of the current environment is probably the key thing for business, and they're looking at ways how can we save costs, and that's all driven through actionable insights. It's all about getting real-time information into the business to make sure that they're making the appropriate decisions. Because just now what I see in the industry is back in the dark ages with pencil and paper, and they don't have that information at hand, you know, to make informed decisions. So I see like the adoption of things like, you know, sensors in the vehicles, which we're gaining a lot of momentum in that space just now. You know, so we've got real-time diagnostic information coming in, we've got tachograph information coming in, compliance, safety. There's a whole range of, you know, technologies that are available there. And again, one of the things that we're working on in the next phase is looking at, say, for example, you know, load sensors within the tanks to give that. And that's just a kind of small snapshot of the technology and what's available and where you can drive these operational efficiencies going forward. But I think ultimately one of the things that we're looking at is in terms of electrification. How do we get EV vehicles on the road, you know, in terms of, you know, the zero emission policies? How do we start driving that forward? And again, that's the kind of the new area, you know, new space that we're looking to drive forward.
Well, I think I would definitely agree with Amye and Tom. I think there's the changes that affect us personally. I think there's the empowerment that IoT and the greater adoption of IoT by businesses, public sector, and by people can bring, where you have that choice of how you move from A to B. The positive effect on actually health as well, taking options of cycling, walking as an alternative to the car, and the positive environmental impact. I think the point that Tom made in terms of greater adoption of IoT, I think we'll naturally see that as companies look to be leaner, more optimized, and actually be more competitive, not necessarily just purely in a local market, but also in an international market. And Tom briefly touched on electric vehicles. I think what we'll start to see as well is greater interest in electric vehicles, particularly for last mile delivery applications. We'll see that. We've started to see that already within our urban spaces, but where I think it's quite exciting is when we start to see the technology continue to develop to the point at which we start to see deployment in the rural space, and that the business models around EV actually adds up to achieve that. And again, potential environmental impact from a very positive standpoint, at least locally, for the adoption of EV for that kind of last mile delivery in those areas.
Yeah, it definitely comes back to that sort of making sure we have the infrastructure there to allow it to expand beyond just urban spaces, which we can get a little bit caught up talking about in these discussions. Steve, finally, let's come to you. What's in your crystal ball right now?
National governments, local government, and organisations have all been to agility and resilience boot camp. They've all had to gear up and intervene and do something. And it's been a really, really, really tough journey. And I think there's been lots of lessons learned. But I think the one thing that has happened, because they've been to boot camp, they're going to be much fitter and more ready to actually intervene and do something when there's another crisis, or a local COVID, or issues around Brexit, or other environmental issues that come up. And I think because of that, they want to connect more to organisations through platforms like Tom, through to the public, through platforms like our own, and enact policy. And I think now, particularly given that we've pretty much gone to a publicly owned transport network now, because of all of the subsidies that are going in, and there's going to be more need for bang for the buck. So it's right, what can we get out of the system? What can we learn? How can we enact and keep that feedback loop of learning, which I think all of us have been coming back to. So I think that agility is something that a more empowered public sector and organisations to do something about problems that are out there and use information to achieve that. I think that's going to be the new reality.
Awesome. I think that's a brilliant point to finish on. It's not just about the shiny new technologies and all of the kind of questions around that. It really is about mindset shifts and moving forward with that open-mindedness, as well as that armed with the feeling that you actually can do things, even though it might be new and difficult and all that sort of a thing. So thank you to Amye, to Tom, to Stephen, to Cade for joining us today to chat about planes, trains, automobiles, and all the technologies that are enabling the future of transport and logistics. Thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. I found it absolutely brilliant to hear that these things are actually happening in Scotland. We're not just talking about innovation and technology, we're living in really exciting times, it seems. So if you enjoyed what you heard, or if you have any further questions where you think CENSIS may be able to help, perhaps as a project you're planning right now, or a challenge that you have in this space, or you just want to find out more about what they do, please feel free to reach out to the CENSIS team by visiting the website at censis.org.uk, where you're going to find all the information you need about how to make contact. Thank you for joining us.